In this video, I'm going to tell you about why I prefer wargaming campaigns to role-playing games, and why you might also. I'm going to start off right here from the get. I will say some things which could be perceived as negative towards role-playing games. I do not think that role-playing games are bad. I first got into like geek/nerd gaming in the 5th grade with Dungeons and Dragons. But my opinion these days is that it's just not for me. It's not my kind of game. But that means if you like it, you keep liking it and have a good time with it. I'm not judging. Just for the comments, just keep playing role-playing games if that's what you want to do. I'm going to not, and we'll go on from there. I'm a little weird in that I basically kind of just play one type of tabletop game. I play tabletop war games, miniatures, that kind of stuff. Most people who are into tabletop play several different things. They might play miniatures and Magic. They might play miniatures and board games. They might play board games and RPGs. They might play Magic and board games. I mean, there's a lot of different options there. I'm a bit of an outlier in that I'm just pretty much miniatures. That's kind of my jam. And there are reasons, various and sundry, as to why that is the case. But for the most part, it's just my preference. I love the painting aspect of it. I like the gaming aspect of it, though I prefer the painting aspect to some degree. But there's a portion of the gaming aspect that I've been getting more and more into over the last several years, and I kind of wanted to talk about it and why I think it's so odd that I focus on it so much when I don't like role-playing that much. So for the most part, when you talk about role-playing in tabletop gaming and you're talking to a normie, for lack of a better term, they're like, a role-playing game, like what's that? And you go, Dungeons and Dragons. And they'll go, oh, okay, cool. Now, they don't necessarily still know what that means, but they have ideas depending on their age group. If they're old like me, they think of the movie E.T. and the kids sitting around the kitchen table and talking about dragons and wizards and stuff like that. Or if they're a little bit younger, maybe they're thinking something like, Stranger Things down in the basement with the Demogorgon and all that kind of stuff. And so, it's a relatively simple thing to just go, look, this is what it's all about. But what most people who are, again, normies, think about when they think about role-playing games is they think about people kind of making silly voices and talking to each other and that kind of stuff over like a piece of grid paper. It's always a piece of grid paper for some reason. But the idea behind it is that in role-playing games, you are generally playing a role, hence the name, and you are, okay, we're going into the tavern. We need to get information about where the cave is. Let's go talk to the tavern keeper, or the cavern keeper, and then we'll do all that stuff. And I'm not interested in that stuff, personally. I'm not saying it's bad, it's not for me. Therefore, it's actually quite useful that I don't play those games. It makes a lot of sense that I instead like miniatures, where in some situations you just have a whole bunch of faceless hordes that you're just going to send across to get slaughtered by the other faceless hordes coming this direction, and you're not thinking about roles or playing them. You're just thinking about these little tiny people and, really not even thinking about them. They're just assets to use. You're the general of the army and that kind of stuff. But what's interesting, though, at least again for me, is that over the last several years, I've gotten away from the big army games with hordes of miniatures, and I've been starting to play games that are a lot smaller. I like skirmish games, which I've talked about a bazillion times here on this channel. That's an official number, a bazillion. And, you're generally playing between maybe, 4 or 5 models, up to 10, maybe as many as 20, but that's kind of on the rarer end. And you have these folks, and I like to personalize them. I like to think about who they are a little bit, and I like to think about like why this group is together and how they got together and that kind of stuff. Specifically while I'm working on them, building them, painting them. These things go through my mind as I'm listening to audiobooks, listening to podcasts. I'm also thinking about my tiny little people that I'm putting together to make this force, this warband, this crew, this cabal, anything along those lines, so that I can use them when we play. And the thing about skirmish games that's so cool is that most of them these days have generally some sort of campaign play. Now, campaign is a word that we think of when we think of role-playing, right? You think of a role-playing campaign, which is when you sit down with your friends and then you play the same kind of story for weeks, months, years at a time, and that's known as a role-playing campaign. And since I'm sitting here thinking about my tiny little people and the roles they might play in the campaign, the question that you might want to ask, and the question, frankly, that I've asked is, well, but, so then why aren't you into role-playing games? And I still don't really understand it a bit. I think it is partially because I'm not interested in the perceived play acting part. That's where I kind of seem to draw the line. I'm interested in the roles and the ideas and the personalities behind the little tiny people that I'm putting together on plastic that are going to run around between plastic trees, and I'm going to roll dice and the whole thing. But I don't want to have to make funny voices, and I don't want to, and I understand that you don't have to do that and everything, but I just don't see myself being put into a role. Again, it's still kind of a, I'm the leader, I'm the general of these models, but you know, so there's, but I don't have to, you know, I can just basically tell them what to do, and then they can handle it and talk to the tavern owner, I guess. That doesn't usually happen in these types of games, but I digress. So what do you do in a campaign game in a miniatures game? Well, it's a lot like what they call a role-playing game in the video game kind of realm. In role-playing video games, it's not so much, again, about we're going to go talk to the tavern owner and things like that and figure out what's going on, although you do have a tendency to do that, actually, in games. You walk up to an NPC, and then you have 3 or 4 or 5 choices of what you can say to them and ask them questions, and it's all kind of canned and everything like that. Again, it's not so much playing a role, it's a little bit of a choose-your-own-adventure. But the thing that makes video game role-playing games and the campaign-style games that I enjoy now these days in skirmish games the same, it's the leveling up, it's the experience points, it's the stats, it's the skills, and the growth of your character from the beginning in a video game, or the growth of your warband in the beginning to what they eventually become as you build the narrative amongst the multiple games or multiple sessions if it's a video game. Now, to me, that's very interesting. Again, like I said, when I'm sitting and working on these models, I am thinking about how they got together, why they're together, that kind of stuff. Especially if I'm kit bashing for something like a model agnostic or a miniature agnostic style game. If you're going to sit down and throw together a bunch of Skaven, well, they're Skaven. You know the story of Skaven. If you're into Age of Sigmar, Skaven gonna Skaven, and it's fine. And you might think a little bit about this guy, why he's got a special weapon and why this one's got a bigger hat or whatever. But when you are sitting down and kind of from whole cloth building your own force from kit bash parts from these models and maybe 3D printed stuff from these folks and putting things together, you put a lot more personality into those models. And I talked years and years ago when my hair was a good deal darker about putting personality into your miniatures. Pachow. And I still do it to this day. I still think about it when I am working on these models. And then that helps to drive me when the time comes to play a campaign game. Some folks don't like campaign games. They just want to play quick one-off games and just be like, we're going to do it, see who wins, and that's great. But I've been getting more and more interested over the last several years in playing campaign games like Frostgrave, Stargrave, Planet 28's got that kind of thing going on. A lot of different games out there have got that. Space Weirdos, which I've just come across recently. A game you may have heard of called Reign in Hell has a very robust campaign system designed to be played in it. Zona Alpha, which I talk about a lot too. There's a lot of different small-scale skirmish games, and a lot of them are miniatures agnostic, that have a campaign system. Now, some of the big ones do as well. Kill Team sort of has a campaign system, a little bit. I really kind of hope if they are going to actually update it this year, I hope they put in a much better campaign system. That would be dope. Warcry has a campaign system. Necromunda does. But when you are sitting down and creating these characters completely, like you do in a role-playing game, you're sitting there in front of a piece of loose leaf paper and you start rolling some dice and figuring out what your character is. It's kind of like that to some degree in miniatures agnostic games, especially the ones that I like. And then that kind of imbues this idea and personality behind what's going on with your group as they progress along the campaign. Now, the question, I guess, becomes, is this at some point going to bridge the gap between where I am now, campaign-style miniature skirmish games? Is that going to eventually turn into me playing Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder or many of the different games that are out there that are role-playing games? Probably not, I gotta say. I gotta be honest, there's still just something about role-playing games, the role-playing portion of it, that just doesn't quite jive with what I want to do when I'm sitting down to play a game. I think a little bit of it is that I want to be able to have conversations and talk about things as the game progresses. And in some situations, specifically in the role-playing games that I've played in the past, It's a little bit more difficult when you're like, we're trying to play this game and now we're having this conversation over here about whatever, and it's hard to do both at once. The group, especially when you're talking about a slightly larger group, has a difficult time sort of focusing, and then it takes forever for anything to get done. When you are playing a miniatures game, generally it's you versus another person, maybe you and 2 other people, maybe 3 tops. But in those situations, you can be socializing and having a good time, and then these things can be going on down here in the table, and it's fine. But you get to kind of do both at one time, and that's, multitasking, which I'm a big fan of. So if there's parts of the role-playing kind of genre that you're interested in, specifically the progression, the leveling up, the getting new gadgets and new relics to add to your, person and all that kind of stuff, like you get in video games very frequently, but you want to play a tabletop game and you don't want to have to go talk to the tavern owner about whether there's been anything spooky going on recently in the city, think about campaign games. Think about looking at tabletop skirmish campaign games that can give you a robust kind of gaming experience where you get to build a narrative and your group gets to grow. Sometimes actually, like, you add more folks, you recruit new people into your group. Sometimes they just get more powerful, more cool stuff, more special powers, special abilities, that kind of thing. And then you can see how the story progresses and you forge the narrative as you go along in your campaign. Take a look at those games if you're looking at role-playing games and just not real sure about doing that. But if you already play role-playing games and you love them, you might also want to think about campaign games because you're going to get a lot of that. And if you want to make goofy voices and talk to the tavern owner, knock yourself out.